Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Florida State in the Orange Bowl, and a game for Georgia that I think actually ends up being more significant and possibly more important than it's been treated as. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes trying to explain why I think that is. And in fact, let me use this as an analogy to set all this up. So yesterday, flying back home we were actually staying in Fort Lauderdale, flying from Fort Lauderdale back home yesterday and sitting in the plane. And it's one of those things where like the video screen in front of you realize, oh, cool, it's got live TV. I said, I wonder if I can find a football game on here. So you click over there, you go to CBS, and you see that Miami is playing the Baltimore Ravens, big NFL game. Now, let me give you an idea of the level of NFL fan that I am. And eventually this is going to kind of make sense as it relates to Georgia football. I'm the sort of NFL fan that's very much the kind of classic casual fan. I have sort of a median level of knowledge probably about the NFL. For instance, I know that Baltimore is one of the better teams this year. I know that Miami's having a very good season. I know enough about the NFL to know that, but I do not know enough about the NFL to realize they're actually playing at 1 p.m. on Sunday. So when I'm fumbling around on that screen in front of me and I realize, oh gosh, Baltimore, Miami, that's a 1 p.m. game here on a Sunday for me to watch on this TV screen as I fly back to Atlanta, my life couldn't be any better than that. I was very, very happy to kind of stumble upon this very pleasant surprise. I am the sort of casual NFL fan that kind of knows who the good teams are, knows who the good players are, but really had no idea of who's playing whom on a particular Sunday. I'm pleasantly surprised to find that out. I say all of that to say this, that most of us have a hard time understanding that level of college football fan, because a lot of you who listen to me every day, you are very much like me. We are not casual college football fans. We are college football obsessives. We are in like the 99.9999 percentile in terms of our deep knowledge and deep care for college football. We have intimate knowledge of everything that goes on with the sport, not just the games, but the recruiting, the transfer portal, and all the various news things that go on. We are entrenched in the world of college football, so we have a very hard time sometimes understanding how the median college football fan operates or necessarily feels about anything. So for those of us who like live in the world, deeply entrenched in college football, the Orange Bowl sort of feels like a glorified scrimmage. You know, it's Georgia more at full strength. It's Florida State completely tapping out on the season, totally giving up, kind of totally moving on. And so therefore, there seems to be a little bit of a subdued interest in the game because we kind of know a little bit of the backstory. But much like me, the casual NFL fan had no idea that Miami and Baltimore were even playing yesterday at 1 p.m. until I stumbled onto the game as I'm flying home. The average college football fan just does not live in the world of college football 365 days out of the year. I mean, average in terms of the fact that, you know, millions of people care about this sport. The kind of median fan, the sort of group of fans in the middle of the bell curve, right there at the top of the bell curve in terms of total numbers, they don't get all of that. And so what we saw on Saturday was a game in which people who are deeply entrenched, who live on social media, who live on message boards, they're deeply entrenched. They kind of know, it sort of feels like this game is less than a full football game. The casual college football fan, the average college football fan, they don't know that at all. They're just like me. They're sitting at home on a holiday weekend. They stumble on Georgia, Florida State, the Orange Bowl. That's awesome. Let me lock in and be a part of this. They just sort of stumble in on this. And I got to tell you, that is a very good thing for Georgia for reasons I'm about to explain. First of all, let me back up this point by showing you something here. I believe we have this from Sports Media Watch on Twitter. Sports Media Watch letting you know that even though that Georgia beat Florida State by 60 points in the Orange Bowl, it was the most watched Orange Bowl that's not a playoff game since 2017. That gives you an idea of how different the sort of average casual college football fan operates in comparison to most of us who are very, very deeply entrenched, very, very immersed in college football culture. The average person's just at home during the holidays and they see the Orange Bowl. They're like, sign me up. Georgia versus Florida State. And those people, millions, what was it, 10 point whatever, 10 point something million people that watched the game. Those people saw Georgia look dominant. Those people saw Florida State look terrible. And the brand building that Georgia was able to do in that game and the brand tarnishing that Florida State had to endure, that very much matters. Georgia got bigger because of its win against Florida State in the eyes of America, and Florida State, who's already been told that it's a less than program because it comes from the ACC, the Florida State brand gets even smaller now that everybody in America saw them lose by 60 points. And you can go knock on all 10 million people who watch this game's doors and say, well, did you realize that so-and-so was opt out and the quarterback was hurt and the blah, 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 blah. Good luck telling 10 million people about that. They don't care. They just saw you get the brakes beat off of you, and now they've moved on to something else. All of that matters. Now, the bad part of that, the negative part of that, is for Florida State to deal with and for Florida State to worry about. But on the good part of this for Georgia, for the 10 million plus people who tuned in to watch this game, what did they see put on display when it comes to the University of Georgia? Well, I thought Javon Bullard probably said it best. Javon, immediately after the game, was interviewed by the folks from the AJC, and Javon talked about the desire of guys like himself and Kamari Lassiter and other Georgia players who had the option of not playing in the game, their decision to play in the game, their devotion to, as Georgia made a very big point of saying, finishing this game, finishing this season off on a very high note. This is the brand building that Georgia was able to do in front of more than 10 million people on Saturday. Javon Bullard to the AJC said it about as well as it could be said. This is Bullard on the field immediately after the game.
I mean, that's why all the guys that are, you know what I'm saying, we get used to guys opting out all over the country. Notice that nobody opted out over here because we all, like, we finished what we started. And, like, this is, like I said, it's a testimony of how hard we work and really the love that we have and the love that we have for this team, man. And it goes way beyond football for us.
How big was it to see so many young guys have success in this game, and how good is the group that's coming back next year?
It's huge. Like I said, Georgia football isn't going nowhere. They're not going nowhere, man. Those young guys are going to come in, they're going to step up, they're going to do great things. I'm so excited to see them play. And it really just, you know what I'm saying, like I said, Georgia ain't going nowhere.
I love Javon Bullard. I really do. As a Georgia fan, he means a lot to me. I think he means a lot to all of you there as well. I think when you think about special players who've come through Georgia during this era, there's no doubt about it. Bullard is clearly one of those. And it's statements like that that I think reinforce just how true this is. And so let me kind of build to this in terms of casual fans stepping in to view this game, what we saw on display from Florida State. Frankly, it ought to be considered an embarrassment. What we saw from Georgia, it is meaningful despite the fact that, you know, the game was marred by opt-outs. The ultimate takeaway from all of this is, if I can only have your attention for like one sentence, and if I can only have enough internet bandwidth, which is probably truer to reality than you realize, if I can only have enough internet bandwidth to give you one message today, you know, this is the thing that I think matters about the Orange Bowl. Ultimately, this game proves there's just a difference. There's a difference between the best teams in the SEC and the best teams of other leagues. The College Football Playoff Selection Committee told you that at the beginning of this process when they excluded Florida State from the playoff. And as much whining and consternation that's gone on about that, we're reminded once again that there's just a difference. Everybody knows it, but nobody really wants to say it because college football really, really wants this to be a national sport. And college football wants as many fans as possible of the various, what used to be Power 5 conferences. Now we're down to Power 4 or whatever, but we're losing our sort of Power 5, conferences, but it's still the idea of as many different conferences believing they play the sport at the highest level is obviously the most financially beneficial thing for the sport. But a lot of that is built on and based on a lie that pretty clearly not every league plays the same level as the others. And the very best of the ACC and the very best of the SEC are just really, really different. And this game proves it. Both Georgia and Florida State were both playing in a meaningless bowl game. But the game just means more to Georgia because it just means more in the SEC. And this is the thing that has got to be top of mind. And Georgia's got to do everything in its power, and the rest of the sort of the top SEC type teams have got to do everything in their power to more forcefully make this argument in the future that you see there are just differences. There are different ways to approach all of this. And Florida State thinks it's sort of fully committed to football, and Florida State thinks it's playing the sport at the highest level because it used to sort of back in the 90s, and it did, 10 years or so ago when it won the national championship. But it's easy to dilute yourself into thinking you're something that you're not when all you're ever doing is comparing yourself to other ACC programs that simply don't even try to play the sport at the highest level. And deep down, Florida State knows that. That's why they're working as hard as they are to get away from the ACC. That's why they're trying to get out of that league, even at great financial penalty, because they know that spending more time around those ACC's middling, mediocre programs is only dragging down Florida State. And I think you see an example of that in a game like this, where both teams had the same set of circumstances. Even though Florida State says, well, we were undefeated, whatever. Both teams were facing the same set of circumstances, and Georgia just took a different approach to it than Florida State did. That's the takeaway. That's when the Georgia brand gets bigger, because Georgia just finds a way to see things like this. Even in a game that a lot of people would say was meaningless, it is still meaningful to Georgia because college football as a sport is more meaningful to a program like Georgia and more meaningful to the very best programs in the SEC in a way that it's not in the ACC, no matter how hard other people try to work to convince you otherwise. That's the takeaway. There's just a difference between top teams in the SEC and top teams in other leagues, and it's the kind of difference that ought to matter in future discussions. And that's why, to make another point here for a moment, I have to admit, and I'm not going to criticize Kirby Smart for this, but I thought that Kirby Smart, in a roundabout way, could have perhaps handled some of his business this month, maybe just a little bit different. Smart, at the end of his post-game press conference on Saturday, made a very forceful argument for the need for change in college football, because one way or another, whether you're pro-Georgia or anti-Georgia, whatever else, we can all agree that a 60-point margin of victory in the Orange Bowl is a little bit of a mockery of competition. This is a little bit of everybody involved in the spectacle should be somewhat embarrassed. I think the ultimate blame for why the game is so lopsided rests with Florida State, but this is not good for the sport to have an Orange Bowl game decided by 60 points. We'd all kind of agree with that. Pro-Georgia or not, this was not a banner day for college football to have the Orange Bowl decided by 60 points. It just wasn't. And so after or I should say in the late stage of the post-game press conference, Kirby Smart got very forceful, almost unsolicited, right? Kind of taking a question in a different direction to really point to the powers to be in college football to say, something's got to be done about this. In fact, instead of me paraphrasing this, let me let you get a chance to hear Kirby Smart in his own words. And when it's over with, I'll tell you why I kind of could have used a little something different from Kirby. Here he is post-game from Saturday.
And maybe I'm wrong here, and maybe this will be a bad soundbite, but people need to see what happened tonight, and they need to fix this. It needs to be fixed. It's very unfortunate that they, who has a good football team and a good football program, are in the position they're in. And everybody can say it's their fault and it's still their own problem. All right? And everybody can say that we had our guys and they didn't have their guys. I can listen to all that. But college football has got to decide what they want. And I know things are changing. And I think things are going to change next year. And you know what? There's going to still be bowl games outside of those. People got to decide what they want and what they really want to get out of it. Because it's really unfortunate for those kids on that sideline that had to play in that game that didn't have their full arsenal. And it affected the game 100%.
So that's a very forceful argument from Kirby Smart. It's a very impassioned plea about making college football look and feel different moving forward. And for a lot of people, that sounds like it makes a lot of sense. In fact, for the majority of Georgia fans, I believe, that sounds like it makes a lot of sense. Kirby Smart is a caretaker of the sport, and he's going to be an advocate for the sport when he possibly can, even on the heels of a Georgia victory. That's what he's choosing to do there. That obviously makes a lot of sense. But let me tell you, as a Georgia partisan, where I think that Kirby, perhaps to a certain degree this month, has somewhat missed the mark. Now, I'm not obviously going to criticize Kirby Smart because Georgia fans, including myself, we all love and respect Kirby Smart for the great success that he's had. But even with that said, hear me out on this just for a moment. When Georgia lost to Alabama in the SEC championship, and admittedly Georgia lost that game. Alabama's a very good program, hard to beat, and in this particular matchup in December, Georgia wasn't able to get that done. But what we said, we meaning the show, what we said was, even on the heels of this victory by 3 points, after 29 straight wins, after 2 straight national championships, that Georgia was still one of the 4 best teams in America. Because, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is a difference between the SEC and the other leagues. No matter how much the powers that be in this sport work to convince you otherwise, that everybody's just sort of playing the same schedule and everybody's doing the same stuff, and undefeated in one league is as valuable as being undefeated in the SEC. That's a bunch of hogwash. It's simply not true. It is a false narrative. And that Georgia in the SEC, battling head-to-head against Alabama, coming up a little bit short, but having won 29 straight games prior to that, having won 2 straight national championships prior to that, was still one of the 4 best teams in America. And there was a strong argument for Georgia's inclusion in the college football playoff in comparison to anybody. Cheating Michigan, Washington from the now dissolved Pac-12, Texas, certainly Florida State, whatever else. There was an argument for Georgia in comparison to anybody to make the college football playoff. Now, my issue is, and this is where I think that Kirby Smart's got to consider his role in being the leader of the Georgia program moving forward, not just being a leader for change in college football, but specifically the job that he's paid to do is be the leader for Georgia football. And what I kind of need from Kirby Smart is to make the argument more forcefully next time for Georgia's inclusion in the college football playoff, as opposed to the argument he made on Saturday night, so forceful for change in college football. Clearly, Kirby Smart is capable of making an impassioned plea after a game. I would like to have heard that same passion after the Alabama game. I know we came up short, but we're still one of the 4 best. Now, I'm sort of led to believe, based on people who know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, that Smart didn't really want to do that. He thought that was kind of conduct unbecoming. And many of you kind of agree, because a lot of you didn't want to make that argument very strongly either at the time. But here's what we got to understand. No matter where college football is going when it comes to like the bowl game opt-outs and the things like that, no matter where this sport's going for the future, there is going to be more arguing in place moving forward. There just is. I think the days and age of an undefeated, obvious national champion are probably about over. The one thing that everybody seems to say is that with each passing year, college football starts to look a little bit more like some version of the NFL. Well, if that's true, and we believe to a certain degree that it is, keep in mind what the NFL almost never has. There's been one undefeated Super Bowl winner in the Super Bowl era, the Miami Dolphins back in 1972. The New England Patriots, 15 years or so, came close to that, lost in the Super Bowl. NFL doesn't have undefeated teams. And as college football starts to look more like the NFL, college football is not going to have any more undefeated teams either. Have you seen the schedule that Georgia's playing next year? Have you seen the schedule that Michigan is playing next year? Most major programs in the Big Ten or the SEC, almost all of them, especially the very best teams, are going to be playing schedules that are just tougher in future years they've been in the past. Here's what that means. There's not going to be obvious undefeated champions where there's no debate about who should be included in the playoffs. There is going to be some level of debate that takes place here moving forward. And what Saturday night, what Saturday night should set us up for is the recognized difference that the best in the SEC has compared to the so-called best in other conferences. And Kirby Smart, I think, moving forward, needs to understand the moment that we're in. He needs to know what time it is. And the time for arguing on behalf of Georgia as strongly as he argued on behalf of college football, that's the time that's arrived here right now. That, listen, we can figure out as a sport what we're going to do with transfer portals and bowl game opt-outs and things like that. But simultaneous to that, there's also an argument being made and taking place about who's winning the actual championships in the games that are taking place in front of us right now. And the argument's so intense that Florida State's willing to sue everybody. Michigan's willing to allegedly, cheat to any degree possible to give themselves an advantage. That's how full contact other folks in this sport are playing right now. And Georgia's got to be ready for that same thing there as well. It was hard to watch this game on Saturday, to be frank, for me, just a little bit, because when you see Georgia winning this game by 60, I don't care who was lining up and playing for Florida State. When you see Georgia winning this game by 60 points, it was such a strong reminder in my mind that Georgia really is truly one of the 4 best teams in America. Would it have beaten Alabama in a rematch? I honestly don't know. But would it have beaten every other non-SEC team in the country? Of course it would. It blew out Michigan a couple of years ago. Scoring 9 straight touchdowns against Florida State is not that different than scoring 7 straight touchdowns against Oregon, the way that Georgia did to begin the 2022 season. Georgia won the national championship game by 58 points last year. One thing we know about Georgia right now is it has put a chasm's worth of difference between itself and every other non-Alabama team in America. And that ought to matter. And it should have mattered for Georgia this year. They should have been in the college football playoff based on the way they played on Saturday night. And they should have argued it more forcefully at the time. That's the big takeaway from this game. Everybody, at least 10 million people, tuned in to watch this. They saw how good Georgia can be, and they saw how little the very best in the ACC sometimes choose to care. That's a difference that makes a distinction. And Georgia deserved inclusion in the college football playoff. And in the future, Georgia, Kirby Smart, and everybody else around this program has got to be ready to argue and make the case for the Dogs, because that is what the future of college football is going to look like. A lot more arguing on the way. And that is DawgNation Daily, represented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. My name is Brandon Adams. Happy to have you with us. Obviously, the show, a little bit of a look in a field that's a little bit different than sometimes we're able to provide. And, listen, we're just going to work through this and sort of figure out where all of this is heading. But we're going to keep a good thought as we do. Calendar rolling into 2024. And, of course, big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia, who make the show possible. Energy-efficient windows and doors, that is what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. So this time of year, when you got cold weather on the outside, a lot of times it seems like that's the case. You can say it's toasty and warm on the inside because those windows and doors from Pella are keeping that heat kind of nice and cozy inside the house the way you want it to be. So you've been hearing me talk about Pella windows and doors for a long time. Could be it's time for you to have a conversation with one of those Pella experts who can tell you even more about the product, what makes it special, and why it's something that you ought to really connect with if you want to take the very best possible care of your house and show the best possible love to what is, in all likelihood, the most significant financial investment you have. Pella Window and Door of Georgia can help you out with all of that. So stop by and see them in their experience center there in Duluth, or have one of their Pella experts come out and talk to you personally. You can do it virtually if you'd like to there as well. It's a no pressure consultation. They're not kind of pushing anything on you. They simply want to educate you of, if you're tired of feeling that sort of drafting inside your house, or if you feel like your energy bills are too high because you've got energy escaping out of the house, or if you just want your home to look better on the outside. You want to be a good neighbor and have great curb appeal, or if you're thinking about the future, possible resale value, any kind of investment, oftentimes to the exterior home that makes it look better when folks drive up and see it for the very first time. That's the kind of thing that can, in some cases, really impact positively your resale value. And so another reason to think about Pella Window and Door of Georgia for all of that. Also, as we begin the new year, great saving opportunities there as well. Between now and January 31st, you can get 10% off Pella projects and 0% APR for 36 months. So stop by and see them, Experience Center in Duluth, or find them online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. That's pellaofga.com/DawgNation. Or you can give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. I believe we've got John Stinchcomb. Sounds like he's ready to join us here right now. So we'll kind of roll into that and kind of do a version of Around the Doghouse with him here today, but also just kind of roll into this regular Georgia football conversation. And as I think I hear John getting ready to go here. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and bring on John Stinchcomb here right now. John, Happy New Year to you. We appreciate you being a part of this discussion here today. Obviously, there's a lot of happiness about the fact that Georgia, won the Orange Bowl by 60 points. It's certainly a weird game, probably not college ball's finest moment to have a storied bowl game like this decided by such a lopsided margin. I blame Florida State for that more than I blame anything else. And, I think for me, the sort of saltiness that I'm sort of left with is it is an obvious proof, I think anyway, that Georgia is one of the four best teams in America. And the argument for inclusion for Georgia in the college football playoff, I think could have and should have been more forcefully made back to begin the month. To me, the real travesty of all of this is a team like Georgia that after winning 29 straight, lost one game by 3 points, dropped from number 1 to number 6. Everybody sort of high-fived because they realized they didn't have to worry about Georgia in the playoff, and everybody just sort of moved on after that. It's up for Georgia, I believe, to make its own case for stuff like this. And the Orange Bowl blowout, to me, shows you just how much of a case that Georgia should have made. What do you think? What is your ultimate reaction to Georgia winning on Saturday afternoon to the margin that it did?
Well, Happy New Year to you and all of DawgNation to begin with. But so much to celebrate. Obviously, huge win for Georgia. What stands out to me in this is there was no right decisions to be made. The right decision should have been made by the 3 conference chairs a couple years back when Jim Phillips, representing the ACC, and 2 other commissioners decide that it's not in our best interest to start the expanded college football playoffs this year. So, there were 6 teams that on paper had a a case to be made for making that Final Four. Obviously, Georgia's one of the best 4 teams in the country. You can't use we're looking for the 4 best as to the reason why you eliminate Florida State and then switch reasons as to why Georgia didn't make the top 4. Because obviously, based on the entire body of work, they are one of the best 4 teams in the country, if not the best on any given Saturday. But I don't blame. I listened to your you kind of explained that Kirby had an opportunity to speak more. Maybe so, but to me, the people I hold accountable is the 3 commissioners that voted against it a couple years back.
No, I think that's a really fair point. And when you look at the strong performance from Georgia on the field, I mean, I think a really cool takeaway from that is that I don't know that I expected Georgia to be as locked in as it was, no matter how much it was saying all the right things prior to this. And I think you and I have even talked about this in the past, that Georgia was clearly saying the right things, and Georgia clearly wasn't having the opt-outs leading into this game the way that Florida State was, or the way that maybe other teams would have, facing similar situations. So there was clearly a vibe being put forth from Georgia that sort of felt positive. But even with that understood, I don't know that I expected Georgia to be this locked in. And I do think there is a positive takeaway from this. From a brand building standpoint, it makes Georgia look pretty cool to have such a big audience tune in to see Georgia winning a game by such a blowout fashion. But also just sort of shows that, a phrase that I use a lot, how you do anything is how you do everything. And Georgia approached this game the same way that it approaches seemingly any other, at least, game of note for sure. And I just think, John, the most positive takeaway, I believe, for Georgia fans moving into a new year is that Georgia may have lost a game and its winning streak may have been, ended. But as Georgia moves into 2024, the overall brand of UGA and the idea of Georgia as a national championship contender in any season, that brand is still just as solid and still just as true as it ever was. To me, that's what getting back on the horse against Florida State, I think probably proves more than anything else.
Yeah, this was a testament to great leadership. And I think it was lessons learned. You look back at the Sugar Bowl game a few years back against Texas, and we were still feeling the ill effects of missing out on the college football playoffs then, and it reflected itself on the field, similar to what we've witnessed for the past month of what's come out of Tallahassee. They're still worried about what happened and the injustices against them rather than focusing on the game ahead. And it really showed on both sides. To me, it made me even more confident in our leadership that Coach Smart and his staff were able to get the guys in that locker room focused on the task at hand. If you look at the numbers, we had almost exactly the number of same players that weren't available to us for one reason or another that Florida State had. So the difference comes down to, 1, the depth, but 2, and probably more importantly, the focus of the players that were available and how they approached the game, from the staff to the team. From well before kickoff, it was pretty apparent that Georgia was about their business. The guys that were on this trip, this game was important to them. They take pride in their work. If we're going to take the field, then we're going to do so in a way that we can be proud of. And Florida State did not do that. They didn't approach this game with the respect that it demands when you face a high-quality opponent, to say, we represent this university, we represent our school, we represent our team, and we represent ourselves every time we take the field. And when you take that half-heartedly, it certainly did reflect on their performance.
I thought the fact that Kendall Milton had 2 touchdowns kind of early in the game, enough to kind of make it more than 100 yards rushing, made him MVP of the game. I thought that was meaningful because we know what Kendall's been through. He's stuck with Georgia, stuck by Georgia, working hard to be as healthy as he could be, to kind of show people what he's capable of being when he's fully healthy. And Kendall Milton, to me, has a little bit of a flash to his game that makes him always a fan favorite because he's kind of a highlight waiting to happen. He has a very fun running style, I think. And he's kind of always been, popular with UGA fans, even though sometimes we were kind of waiting to see the best of Kendall on the field because He's dealt with his share of injuries, things like that. But Kirby Smart's always been adamant that no one was working harder than Kendall to kind of be back out there and be at full strength and fully ready to go for Georgia. And to kind of conclude his Georgia career, which we believe it's going to be, kind of conclude his Georgia career, Kendall goes on a very high note. I was very proud for him on Saturday. I've enjoyed watching him play. I think he has a chance to be a very good NFL running back and kind of further the legacy of Georgia as so-called RBU, running back university. I thought it was very meaningful to see Kendall be named MVP on Saturday night. How fun was that for you?
Yeah, he's a great representative of the University of Georgia. And throughout his career, I felt for him because very rarely was he at 100%. He played his very best football these last 5 games of his what potentially could be his last year at Georgia. And that's always great to see. But for Kendall, to me, it was a case of never really having the opportunity, mainly because of injuries, that his talent could predicate. And to see him kind of get the recognition as the MVP of the bowl and wrap up a career that he should be proud of. Aside from getting sidetracked because of injuries, he's been a great representative of the University of Georgia. His commitment to bringing it in practice has been well noted throughout his career and has been a great representative for our university.
If the final moment in a Georgia uniform for Ladd McConkey was the play where he's about to throw it, decides to tuck it and run, gets the touchdown, if that's the end for Ladd in a Georgia uniform, I fear that it might be. But if that's the end for Ladd in a Georgia uniform, what a way to go out. And that's another one of those moments that kind of sticks out to me as one of the things that I don't care who Georgia was lining up and playing. The Orange Bowl was incredibly entertaining for a lot of UGA fans, and the McConkey play is an example of that.
Isn't it fun to watch just guys that have that innate ability to create? Yeah. And, as we constantly comment about the coordinators and we need to design better plays, when you've got guys like Ladd out there, it could be the wrong play and they make you right. And he's done it so consistently. And that was a case in point for the amount of playmaking ability that he possesses and has shown throughout his entire career at Georgia.
Got a couple of other issues I want to get into with you. So let me just ask you kind of a broad-based question before we move on. Anything else from the Orange Bowl really stick out to you in terms of, what you saw? It was, I think, a lot of fun. And, we can obviously kind of get it more into what college football needs to do in response to this, and we'll get into that more in a moment. But as far as the actual Georgia performance goes, is there anything else from the game, John, that stands out to you?
Yeah, well, 2 things stood out just in general. One, the faith that I now have or continue to have in our staff to prepare and put our team in a position to succeed consistently. We've learned from past mistakes, I feel, just with the amount of preparation, the ability to get this team focused on a game that so many others say no longer matters because you're outside of college football playoffs. It mattered to them. It mattered to the program. I think that the positive energy that you take, and this is the second point for the players that will be returning, and the amount of opportunities that they had on Saturday to show that they're ready and will be the next wave to represent the University of Georgia when we take the field. What a great opportunity for them for a number of plays in that second half. We look at an offensive line group, and they were not alone, of guys that will most likely be the next to carry the torch. And that was across the board. So many different position groups where guys had those opportunities, even with a wave of the number 1 recruiting class coming in and some transfers. It was a great opportunity for them to say, hey, I'm next in line here. And it's going to be a battle for you young bucks to kind of don't expect to just walk right in, because we've got some really talented players that have been in-house cultivating talent.
So along those lines, let's kind of move on to kind of some of the stuff that's next for Georgia. And there's already been kind of a flood of news coming out in the last 24 hours, sort of expected that it might be. And one thing to keep in mind here is today's January 1st. The transfer portal still is open until January 4th. So yesterday, and we'll show you this on the screen, C.J. Smith, the Georgia wide receiver, he goes into the transfer portal. That being reported by On3. Jared Zirkle, the Georgia kicker, who had kind of tried his hand in the portal to see if anything was available for him. Well, apparently there is. He's on his way to Texas A&M. Daniel Harris, good news for Georgia, that he had kind of talked about going to the portal, declared that he was going to, but never officially took that next step and played a lot on Saturday. Seems like he's a big part of the future here for UGA. So, John, whether it be, C.J. Smith going in, Zirkle moving on, Daniel Harris changing his mind. We're not done with portal news as of yet. Now, we think it's probably kind of sort of whittling down. Jeff Sindell had a good story with Mikael Williams, where Williams kind of put to bed any kind of rumor that he might go into the portal after a little bit of chatter about that. But we got a couple of more days, if you're a Georgia fan, of sort of bracing for this portal news one way or another. And as we kind of go through the rest of this, that's still out there, right?
Yeah, and I would say this, for where Georgia's at compared to every other team in the country, the portal can be used as a good thing for us, rather than we're going to lose our top talent. You look at other teams and other programs, it makes me think of Georgia Tech a couple of years ago with Jahmyr Gibbs, and they lose him. You lose your best player on the roster to another team. That's not the situation Georgia's in. You look at these transfers, and the majority of them are players that, have had some opportunity here and haven't really matriculated or shifted themselves out to the top. And so we need those roster spots. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. If we're going to have the best recruiting class and we sign more than 25 guys, there's almost 30 guys in this class incoming, including some transfers that were some of the best on their rosters with Etienne and obviously Humphreys. So there's some guys that are coming in that are going to compete. Well, if that improves our roster, that also means we have to do a little trimming at the bottom end of that roster for guys that maybe have had some time on campus but don't see those opportunities. This is, like it or not, with the transfer portal the way it is, this is the way it should be for a program like Georgia, where guys can say, maybe I can go to another program, whether it be a Syracuse, a Kentucky, or a Texas A&M, and there's better opportunity for me there, having spent a couple years here and kind of seeing the writing on the wall. So I think for Georgia fans, you look at it and go, there's some guys we don't want to lose. Obviously, I think a guy like Daniel Harris is someone that the University of Georgia and the staff is going, whoa, this is a player that we have a vision for, that next year is going to be potentially a cornerstone for the secondary, and we need to hold on to them. For some of these other players, that's not the case.
Yeah, I want to talk to you more about the Georgia secondary in a moment, because I think that's about to get really interesting very fast. We'll do that. Let me also talk about Amarius Mims, who has announced his intention to move on the NFL draft. Not a surprise. He didn't join the team in Miami, did not play. Obviously, he's battled injury, and I think Amarius Mims has a chance to truly be. I think he's projected to be, obviously, a first-round pick. When you think about a guy that did not start a ton at Georgia because of the fact that he had to wait his turn there for a minute, also dealt with a little bit of injury, but in the small number of starts he has had at UGA to prove his value as a first-round pick, John, I think that really speaks to Georgia's ability to develop its players. First of all, that's a really good thing. And man, when you do what might have been about this 2023 season for Georgia, Mims not leaving the SEC championship, how does that make that game different? The games that Mims obviously missed for Georgia this year. Georgia's clearly a much better team when Amarius Mims was in. He's very deserving of being a first-round pick. He's going to be. Good for him, good for Georgia for developing him. But my gosh, when you think about, just a couple of things being perhaps a little bit different for Georgia this year, more of Amarius Mims in the SEC championship game is certainly one of those things that Georgia fans will have to kind of sort of live with here for a little bit, because that is a very, very good player. And he's going to move on to the NFL, and Georgia fans will have to replace him for next season.
Yeah, and for Mims, there's two perspectives here. One, his ceiling is through the roof. I mean, he even coming in, you look at him and you say, God only built so many people in this mold, and Amarius Mims' size and his ability to move at that size is exceptional. As a Georgia fan, we got to see that very little. I mean, only a handful of options. And this year, whether it was affected by injury, which it was at times, or for the fact that there was protection of his draft value, because there's plenty that have said you're going to be a first-round pick, despite the fact that you've only started a handful of games, probably the least of any potential first-round pick in quite some time, that there were outside voices that kind of contributed to his decision-making as to when and if he was returning to the field. Now, I'm not questioning his manhood or his toughness, but that's a very realistic perspective of how players are approaching the game. There are very few guys that look at it now and say, hey, I'm willing to put myself on the line, which makes the others stand out. It made it quite the anomaly when only a handful of weeks, less than the usual projected time for post tightrope surgery, that Brock Bowers is back on the field. Now, maybe that's a case where he came back a little early if he wasn't able to play these last two games post that quick return. But there's more at play than just, am I healthy enough to go these days? And we've seen it with other players where if you've got that high draft potential, that becomes part of the equation. And I certainly feel like that was the case for Amarius.
A lot of news coming out of the Georgia secondary. Kamari Lassiter has announced that he's moving on to the NFL draft. No surprise there. It seems like he's destined to be a first-round pick. Then you start thinking about Javon Bullard, who's also moving on to the NFL draft. That's a guy who's had a great Georgia career and I think has a chance to be a very good NFL safety. I'm, I guess, less certain about what round he might be drafted in, but I think that he can certainly be a big part of the NFL in the future. And then Tyke Smith, who's been at Georgia now for a while and kind of had to wait his turn, battled some injury, and probably had to kind of fight for a little bit of a playoff spot. Not playoff spot, but I got playoff spots in the brain right now. A playing spot is what I mean to say. Eventually he settled into a really nice role for this Georgia team here this year, and he is also moving on there as well. So, John, let me deal with a couple of things for you on this, and I guess let me mention Bullard by name here, because when we make a list of the guys who've been really special for Georgia over the course of this kind of national championship era, 21, 22, and, here kind of, seeing that streak come to an end here in 2023, Javon Bullard's one of my favorites. Javon Bullard last year in the biggest games for Georgia was amazing. The individual moment from this run that I don't know why I think about this so frequently. I do. I even go back and watch the video replay of it a lot. Like the blitz sack he had against Tennessee, second half, I think it was fourth quarter of that game back in 2022. Crowd goes wild. Bullard kind of starting to make a name for himself as a very special Georgia player at that time. Javon Bullard's one of my favorites. And I know there's a long list of guys that are going to need to be special reverence in terms of the guys who played at Georgia during this period of time. But Bullard's got to have a big spot on that list, I believe.
Yeah, and it's because of the way they approach the game. For Javon Bullard, I'm like you. I love watching him play. I love watching Ladd McConkey play. The similarities there is they come in not quite as highly touted because maybe they're not the fastest on the team. Maybe they don't fit that mold of freakishly big, or if you're going to put together the freaks of the SEC, they're not making that list. But you put them on a football field, and those guys play with a desire that's unmatched. And he would stick his nose in every pile that you could possibly imagine. There was not a situation that he would shy away from. He was aggressive and fun to watch. And there is always going to be a place for guys that just are football players. Javon Bullard is one of them. It was fun to watch, and it's going to be a hole, but that's why it's so important to continue to bring in these top recruits. And not only this year, but last year as well. There's some guys that are kind of chomping at the bit, waiting for those opportunities. And that's where Georgia football lives these years. Is there's a high probability that there are a number in the teens of guys that are going to be drafted to the NFL or at least go to the NFL. And that's an annual basis, which will provide opportunities for other great players to step in. When Javon Bullard first took the field, nobody was like, "Hey, sweet, we got him coming to replace some of our studs that we had in the past, guys that we loved." And he has endeared himself with the way he approached the game and the way he played it, and the number of big time plays that will be an opportunity for the next guy to do the same.
But the point you're making is one that I think is so important, which is that, okay, so Kamari Lassiter's been so good that he makes it look easy, and that's always a bad thing because when he steps away, you realize, oh, boy, playing lockdown corner, not as easy as Kamari Lassiter made it look, and Bullard was very good. Tyke Smith played a very important role. What's about to happen for the Georgia secondary, I think, is going to be fascinating. And I am certainly not here to suggest, the next crop is going to be just as good as this crop, because transitions like that are never error-free. There's always a little bit of growing pain around some of that kind of stuff. But it does create an opportunity for KJ Bolden, who I'm really excited about. Janelle Aguero, who's been here for a year. That could be one of the most important names for Georgia in 2024 in terms of I sort of see him maybe slotting in where Tyke Smith was here this year. That could be a really big deal for him.
BA,
go ahead.
Post G Day and training camp, Aguero was one of the guys that got mentioned the most. So there is real reason for the hype surrounding his name. Sorry to cut you off, but just tagging in on that. I mean, there's a lot of guys, and I'm sure you're about to go through a list, including the number one corner in the signing class. So sorry to steal your thunder, but wanted to echo that.
You're absolutely right. And Ellis Robbins would be the next name to mention there of, probably a little thin right now, but man, he's long body. And everybody says that he is the real deal. And then he kind of lives up to what you expect a guy rated that high to be, that these are big shoes to fill. But this conversation that's about to occur this year, and spring practice will be here before you know it, this conversation on the Georgia secondary, I believe, is going to be a lot of fun because there are a lot of, young guys waiting the wings. They could have their chance to be really very impressive.
Yeah, across the board. And secondary is one of those positions where you have to have talent back there. And Tyke was one who, when he first transferred to Georgia, he had to wait. I mean, there was a couple years where we're going, did we get a freshman All-American or freshman All-Conference player in the transfer portal? What happened to Tyke Smith? And he had to kind of matriculate through the system here at Georgia before he earned that opportunity and played, I think, one of the most underrated, undervalued positions on the field for this Georgia defense this year. Made a ton of plays and continued to get better. I mean, by the end of the season was a guy that you kind of expected on the edge to come in and make some of those stops, either in those slant routes that everyone likes to throw in those third and short situations, or those jet sweeps where he'd come up and, bloody somebody's nose with the way he'd pop them. So, it's a guy that Georgia continues to find talent across the board, whether it's in-house development by their second or third year or transfer portal, which has been very limited. Tyke is kind of the exception there, but primarily through recruiting and signing some of the very best talent. And I think the retention of Daniel Harris shows, and what we saw, he gets beat for the longest play that Florida State had. Was it because of bad coverage? No, he was right there on top of the guy. It was a great throw to a receiver who made a play. But there's a lot of excitement there, and rightfully so. There are some young pieces to this Georgia secondary that, do you ever feel good about losing first-round talent at a cornerback position? No, absolutely not. But what makes you feel better is when you've got guys in-house or coming in-house that have the chops to kind of play at that same level. Maybe not day one, but certainly grow into that space.
I want to be respectful of your time. I've taken a lot of it already here on New Year's Day. You're kind enough to join us. Let me squeeze in one more topic, though, if you don't mind. You kind of addressed this right at the beginning of our conversation about what Kirby Smart said. Essentially, like what we all say, you're standing around like the breakfast table or with your friends, politics comes up. Somebody says, somebody ought to do something about that, right? Like we've kind of sort of reached that phase of the college football discussion where people see things going on and there's this thought of somebody ought to do something about that. And Kirby Smart sort of had his moment like that there on Saturday saying, hey, we got to fix this. Well, John, let me ask you here to kind of close this out. I realize this is a bigger conversation than the time we have, allotted here, but what is this that needs to be fixed? And what is the thing that needs to happen to fix it? Everybody agrees that something's not quite right with college football right now, but can we get more specific about what really needs to happen and who has the power to do the thing that needs to be done?
Yeah, there's a couple pieces. I mean, the system isn't broken, but there's broken pieces within the system. Obviously, with the NIL and transfer portal, the way that those have been married, there is obviously, that has to be cleaned up. The fact that third parties have equal, if not more, influence on the decisions of where a player plays, that's a problem. If you look at the conference alignments and the separation and the parity that exists, that's a problem. You look at the calendar, you look at the fact that transfer portal, when it's opened, we're still calling these individuals student athletes. So the fact that school is still a part of that needs to be a part of the equation unless you separate that out. If you start looking at, whether the players get paid, well, if players get paid through the university, they become employees. What does that do with the relationship to Title IX and student athlete status, I think that all that needs to be looked at. So who are the players involved that need to make those things happen? I think you look at the antitrust cases, the federal litigation that's outstanding, that needs to get ironed out. And there's probably, it sounds kind of weird to say this, but Congress probably plays a role in straightening out some of the options and direction of college football, which there are some difficult decisions that are going to need to be made. And a lot of people are not going to like it. Bowls aren't going to like it. There's some football programs that are not going to be, that aren't going to love it because they're going to be left out. I think there's going to be an extension of the stratification that's already occurred between the SEC and the Big Ten and everyone else. I think the ACC schools, FSU specifically, this year is saying we are on the outside looking in to the first tier of football. And there are other programs that are trying to figure out and navigate these waters that are uncharted. We're in a new space across the board.
It really is fascinating stuff, John. There's so much I could say, but we'll save it for future weeks because something tells me in 2024, we're not going to stop talking about anything like this anytime soon, whether we want to or not. John, please pass along thanks to your family for sharing some of your time here on New Year's Day, with us. And obviously we'll let you get back to, you guys going to have the greens and the black eyed peas the way that, I know you're a sort of dyed in the wool Southerner the way that I am. My grandmother grew up serving black eyed peas and I guess it's collard greens on New Year's. Yeah, on New Year's Day. So I'm sure that you will keep that tradition going the way that a good Southern family would.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the best way to start off the new year. And happy holidays. Happy New Year to you, BA, and to all of DawgNation.
John, we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Sounds good. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed. Strong stuff there from John Stinchcomb, who, listen, we got to have voices like that speaking on issues like what is coming for college football in the future. People who care about the sport. We got to have, good stakeholders willing to sort of step up and speak on behalf of the sport. I want to talk more about that here in a moment as we transition to cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And by the way, do y'all do that? Because I'm telling you right now, in my family, it was a big deal. We had collard greens and black-eyed peas every New Year's Day. And the collard greens were supposed to be to give you money. And the black-eyed peas were supposed to be like to give you a good luck, I think, for the new year, which I'm sure makes it sound incredibly superstitious. But I think a lot of people in the South did that. That was a pretty big thing there for a while. I don't know that we still do that anymore, but that was a pretty big deal there for a while. The collard greens and the black-eyed peas there on New Year's Day. But nonetheless, we'll transition here to cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Spent a lot of time in Fort Lauderdale this past week, sometime in Miami. Technically, I actually don't know that I ever got into like true Miami proper. We were in Fort Lauderdale, then we were in Miami Gardens. I don't think I ever actually got into like the actual Miami part of Miami. But nonetheless, when I was in the airport yesterday, kind of looking out, and actually even at the hotel too, when you're elevated enough to sort of look out across the landscape there, I saw right across the Port Everglades, which is right there in Fort Lauderdale. So one of those gorgeous Royal Caribbean cruise ships right there in port. I'm actually not sure what ship that it was, but saw it right there in Port Everglades. It's a reminder to me of how much fun 2024 is going to be when it comes to Royal Caribbean. So many brand new things on the way here. You've heard me talk about them all. The debut of Icon of the Seas, largest cruise ship ever constructed. I'm going to have a chance to sail on that coming up in a few weeks. I got to tell you, I'm pretty ready for a vacation. So I'm very, very excited for all of that, and especially this Royal Caribbean cruise vacation on board Icon of the Seas. The debut of Utopia of the Seas, that comes up in July. That's going to be sailing out of Port Canaveral. It's going to be 3 and 4 night sailings on the brand new Oasis class cruise ship. Boy, that's going to be a lot of fun. New things coming for Perfect Day Coco Cay there as well. My New Year's resolution is to spend more time on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, and you can do the same thing there as well. Jessica Slater can help you out with it. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Or you can email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. Here's the deal. Royal Caribbean wants you to have the best Royal Caribbean cruise vacation possible. They believe that a great travel agent is the best way for you to do that, and working with Jessica doesn't cost you anything. She's a Royal Caribbean expert. She knows the entire array of options that Royal Caribbean provides, and she can help you select the best one for you. Royal Caribbean will pay her for doing that. It doesn't cost you anything. So book your Royal Caribbean cruise vacation with Jessica. And I haven't seen Jessica in a while. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other some here in 2024 as we get ready to do some sailings, including the DawgNation cruise coming up in April. So that is going to be a great, great time. By the way, if you want more information for the Dog Nation Cruise, and y'all, we are in the year of the cruise. It's 2024 now, so when I say April of 2024, now I can just say April. It's coming up, royaldogs.com for more on that. All right, so let's cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let's sort of think about the year that's about to be for college football. And we're all getting ready for big change here. Divisions in the SEC, they're gone. Texas and Oklahoma, they're about to be in this league. 12-team playoff, we're about to be in it. And y'all, I don't think that we have fully appreciated just how different the 12-team playoff era is going to be and just how different the conversation is going to be. I think that, we're still so entrenched in the year that has been that we haven't probably wrapped our mind around how new all of this is going to feel. What the quarterfinal sites are going to be, what the semifinal sites are going to be, who gets the bye to that next round, and who has to play, on those matchups going on the road, and who gets a chance to host a playoff game. All of that is new for the new year, which is why I said what I said a moment ago about, Kirby Smart, I believe, is going to have to get more comfortable being more forceful in arguing on Georgia's behalf, because there's not going to be less arguing because of a 12-team playoff. There's going to be more arguing because there's going to be more things to argue about. Where do you play? Who do you play? When do you play the game? All of that kind of stuff is going to be up for grabs in the sort of the new argument that's going to take place. And I do think that Georgia's going to be ready for that. And I don't care if it looks tacky. You have got to pound your fist on the table and make the case, as we said at the beginning of our show today, that there's a difference between Georgia and these other non-SEC teams, the Florida States, the Michigans, the Oregons, all these teams that Georgia spends all this time laying waste to. That has got to matter in future arguments. And Georgia's got to be ready to make that argument, as distasteful as it sort of looks. And, I get the idea of what some Georgia fans are going to say. Well, I want to beat Alabama on the field. I don't want to argue about whatever else. Listen, I get that. But here's the thing you got to understand too, is that Alabama is not squeamish about making these arguments. Georgia has had one national championship that came in which they were put in the playoff without winning the SEC. Alabama's got two in the Nick Saban era alone. Alabama does not back down from arguing on its behalf, no matter what the facts are in the case. And for the Georgia fans who may want to say, well, Alabama already beat us, so therefore we don't deserve to be national champions. Do you hear any Alabama? I'm asking this question like legitimately. Do you hear any Alabama fan or Nick Saban himself saying that about another team that's in the playoff, Texas? In other words, if Georgia doesn't deserve a rematch with Alabama, then Alabama doesn't deserve a rematch with Texas. But Alabama fans certainly aren't willing to concede that. They're willing to say that if we get there, if we win the rematch, then we're the real national champions, which is exactly what they should say, because everybody ought to argue whatever is in their own best interest, which Alabama is never afraid of doing. Nick Saban himself in particular is never afraid of doing that. And the brand new era of college football that we're moving into, Georgia's got to be comfortable doing the very same thing, because in the new era of expanded playoffs and tougher schedules and probably multiple losses for everyone, we may see at least 2 losses for every national champion moving forward to the next decade. That may be what the new landscape of college football is going to look like. And in that world, arguing is going to matter more than ever. So roll up your sleeves and be ready for it. That's some of the change that's on the way. Now, one more kind of like parallel point to this here for a moment. When you look at what Kirby said on Saturday about, hey, somebody's going to do something about this. This is not good for college football. We got to figure all this out. There's obviously a lot of what Kirby said that does deserve to be taken seriously. And as I said to John, we all seem to agree, boy, change is needed. But I think that's where our agreement kind of breaks up a little bit, or where the clarity becomes a little bit less, easy to establish of what exactly is the problem and what exactly is the fix to the problem. Everybody sort of agrees that college football is in kind of a weird spot. There is a problem, but what exactly do you do about that problem? And specifically, what is the problem? This is where I think things get a little bit tricky. And all I can say is this. I really feel like as we move into this new year, this year of change that's on its way for college football, the one thing that somebody with some actual power somewhere has got to be comfortable doing. And over the course of the last couple of years, I'm talking about like administrative level people, NCAA level people, to the extent that's even still an organization that exists. The most powerful figures in college athletics, the one thing they've sort of seemingly lost the will to do is argue for the right of college athletics to exist. The sort of amateur model that has been in place for, more than a century. Public favor has seemed to turn against that. For all these court cases that have gone against the NCAA and against college athletics in recent years. I'm not a lawyer, but what I can tell you is the laws haven't changed in terms of why suddenly the NCAA can't win in court. The laws haven't changed. It's just the interpretation of these laws that has changed. And the interpretation of these laws have changed because public opinion has changed about the idea of college athletics. And we can get into why public opinion has changed and how it's shifted and what has influenced that shift. But in a world in which suddenly the public tide has seemingly turned against college athletics, those who lead college athletics have sort of lost their will to defend their livelihood because they're afraid of the criticism that comes their way from doing something that a lot of people in the public have sort of decided they don't like, the college athletics amateur model. And I believe of all the sort of discussion about, well, somebody's going to do something about this, I think the thing that needs to be done is somebody's got to develop the will or the cleverness or something. Someone's got to develop the willingness to argue on behalf of the system. Because if no one argues on behalf of the system's going to be totally trampled over. And the system's going to be totally destroyed. And there are plenty of people who will cheer that when it happens as a very, very good thing because they view it to be a sham and they think it's, oppressive or whatever else. But when you look around, college athletics are still incredibly popular. These bowl games, for as bad as they are still incredibly popular. Other sports, basketball, women's basketball, baseball, softball, all the ratings for all of these sports in comparison to their previous track record, all very, very high right now, higher than they've ever been because people still really like college athletics. In a day and age in which other sports ratings are kind of going down compared to what they've been before, the college athletics ratings across all sports seem to still be going up. People still really like college athletics. Are we sure we want to just destroy that? Are we sure we just want to tinker with that so much? Because here's the thing that wise people sort of understand, that when you try to make a minor tweak to a complex system, you set in space a series of events that you don't have control of. Complex systems are difficult to manage. And when you try to make a minor tweak to a complex system, you set yourself up for unintended consequences. And I just wish that somebody smarter than me would be willing to make that argument. And perhaps in the new year, that is what we'll see. As far as today's action, it is New Year's Day, traditional day of big-time bowl games. We have some of that. A couple of SEC teams in action prior to the college football playoff. We've got LSU against Wisconsin. We have got Tennessee against Iowa. Now, I started the show today by saying there is a difference between the very best of the SEC and the very best of other leagues. That does not mean, though, that every SEC team is always going to go out and dominate any team that it plays from some other league. That's not what I mean when I say there's a difference. There is a difference between Georgia and the best of other leagues, but that doesn't mean the SEC is always set up for dominance no matter what. And I say all of that to say, I actually have a sneaking suspicion, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, I often am. I have a little bit of a sneaking suspicion that LSU and Tennessee could both be in a little bit of trouble today. Now, we have seen during this bowl season, a lot of these Big Ten defenses that were so vaunted and so heralded, oftentimes the success of that defense was only built on the back of playing against some pretty moribund Big Ten offenses on a pretty regular basis. Maybe Iowa is the latest example of that. Statistically, this is a very good defense, but maybe that's only true because they've been playing against some very bad Big Ten offenses. But I'm going to be forced to assume here for a moment that the Iowa defense is at least good enough and the Iowa coaching staff is at least sharp enough. They can flummox Nico Iamaleava for Tennessee, who's making his first start today for the Vols. I think Iowa defense is probably a pretty bad matchup for a quarterback like Nico making his first start. Now, I'm fascinated by seeing him because allegedly he was paid millions of dollars in NIL and things like that. He's supposed to be the next big thing. Did not have much of a freshman season to make you think that. But that's kind of, what he's supposed to be here right now. So seeing him today against Iowa, I think could be interesting. But something tells me the Iowa defense may have a little something for Nico. We'll find out if that is the case. And the other game, LSU and Wisconsin, this is the one that's in Tampa, I think. Yeah, the Tampa game used to be the Outback Bowl. There's a little bit of a weird vibe around LSU right now, I believe. A lot of weird vibes during bowl season, I get that, but a little bit of a weird vibe around LSU. Jaden Daniels obviously not playing here in this game. There's also some weird Brian Kelly rumors right now. I don't know if there's any truth to these. I don't have any reason to think there are true. But the thought that if Jim Harbaugh, who, by the way, has hired an agent who seems really, really intent on exploring his NFL options, that if Harbaugh were to go to the NFL, that Brian Kelly would be a candidate for the Michigan job. Obviously, LSU is a better job than Michigan, I believe, because of the national championships that LSU has won. But because of how many national championships LSU has, it's also a very tough job, too. If Brian Kelly kind of looks across that much the same way he looks around Notre Dame and realizes, oh, I can't win here. I can't win a national championship here. Let me go try my hand at LSU. If Kelly looks around and says, oh, boy, after a couple of years of being here at LSU, I realized just how tough this league really is, how challenging all of this really is. If that's the way that that Kelly sort of sees this, maybe he would consider a Michigan opening if it were to come available. Either way, the LSU situation this year has been weird, and I think it's weird going to the bowl game. I think Luke Fickell's a pretty good coach. I sort of like Wisconsin today against LSU. So I'm kind of taking a stand against both of the SEC teams in the early New Year's action. And then by now, it seems like we've sort of talked the college ball playoff games to death, but I'll give you both of those here just for a moment. I think Texas is pretty good. I really do. I think that Texas is pretty good. And I think as they get ready to move into the SEC, I think they come into this league feeling very much like an SEC team. Really dynamic wide receiver play. I think Quinn Ewers has been good at quarterback. Obviously, there was the interesting photo that came out this week of Ewers sort of looking over his shoulder at Arch Manning with all the media around him. That was interesting to see. Arch is obviously a guy that has a bright future, but it seems like we might have to wait a little more for that to come available. It seems like Quinn Ewers probably coming back next season for Texas. But the other thing that makes the Longhorns feel much more like an SEC team is they're really good in the defensive line. I think that Texas probably has the best defensive line in the college football playoff. I assume they will handle Washington easily, but y'all, I've also been wrong about Washington over and over this year. So take this all with a grain of salt. I just don't quite know that I've got a proper handle on this Washington team, but the best guess that I'm able to make is that Texas takes care of business fairly easily against Washington here tonight. We'll see if that is indeed the case. And when it comes to Alabama, Michigan, there is no positive outcome here in this game. Either team winning seems pretty distasteful in my mind. But as square as it makes me sound, and as perhaps naive as it makes me sound, the best available evidence I have in front of me leads me to believe that Michigan has greatly aided from its sign stealing. And the number one piece of proof I have from that is the work that Michigan was willing to do, the financial cost that Michigan was willing to make to keep it all going. Michigan seemed to believe they were getting something out of this. And the performance for Michigan, especially J.J. McCarthy, after all of this has come to light, nowhere near as good as some of those performances prior to all of this. I just think the statistical evidence suggests that Michigan was aided by cheating. No one wants to talk about this, but it is obvious to me just looking at the results. So tonight, this afternoon, I guess, my expectation is that Alabama will beat Michigan somewhat handily. And it's going to be really frustrating for Georgia fans to watch because Georgia fans will be once again forced to deal with the idea that if the SEC championship game could have gone just a little bit different, or if the argument for Georgia in the playoff could have gotten just a little bit more of a fair hearing, then Georgia could be laying waste to these other non-SEC teams just as easily as Alabama's about to. And that maybe Georgia could have, gotten one more crack at the Alabama Crimson Tide in the national championship game, much like happened in 2021. But I sort of have a suspicion that even though Michigan's been a small favorite for the entirety of this month, I believe that point spread is built on the back of some faulty data. Michigan is not as good as their statistical profile suggests because they have been aided by cheating. And tonight, they're going to have that to their advantage. And I believe that Alabama probably beats them up fairly similarly to the way that Georgia did back in 2021. And Jim Harbaugh loses in the national semifinal for a third straight year. I think that's what we're heading for. We will see if that's the case, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Either way, we'll be back tomorrow to talk about all of that for the college football playoff and what it means from a Georgia perspective. But for now, we'll get ready to wrap up this edition of the show and somehow end up being kind of a long one, not really intending for it to be. But we'll do so with a golden shoe. Our buddy Jermaine King shares this. And obviously last night, a lot of Georgia fans were reminiscing about when the clock struck midnight a year ago and where we all were. And by the way, last night, my wife was saying, because we were sitting together on the couch there for New Year's Eve, this is like the first New Year's Eve that she and I had spent together at the stroke of midnight in quite some time, because last couple of years we've been celebrating Georgia national semifinal wins at that time. Jermaine King also kind of reflecting on that for his golden shoe, saying earlier this year, I convinced myself that I must have fallen asleep early these past 2 New Year's Eves because I couldn't remember watching the peach or the apple drop at midnight. Then, he says, it hit me. I was awake both years and missed the celebrations because of the dogs. Yeah, Jermaine, our last couple of New Year's Eve have been special indeed. A win against Michigan in 2021, a win against Ohio State in 2022. Not able to enjoy that last night, but certainly plenty of good memories of the 2 years that were, and plenty of enthusiasm about what 2024 can be as well. A well-earned golden shoe coming your way for pointing that out. Very, very good stuff. And lousy, stinking Gators, their New Year's, the same as the old year, more misery coming their way. It's been 1,150 days since Florida has beaten Georgia. That's our Gator Hater Updater. And we'll begin the new year the same way we closed out the old year, which is laughing and making fun of those lousy, stinking Gators. So have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right, we are not going to go real long today because it is New Year's Day, and got a lot of folks here helping us out. We want to be respectful to them and their families. So we're going to let that be the case, but we are going to take a kind of a trip around each of the comment sections. And obviously we've got a whole, somehow, some way we'll get on the air here. And we've got a whole, long, series of topics to discuss in the days to come. Who's leaving Georgia, who's coming into Georgia, who steps up next year, where Georgia fits into the overall landscape. All of that is very much on the way here. Third, Will says, did you see the new Brett Thorson gem on X? He says the office scene of Michael screaming, no. It was Thorson realizing Beck is coming back. Yeah, Brett Thorson is very good at social media. He is a very, very funny guy. And I have very much enjoyed his stuff related to starting off with Stetson Bennett and now Carson Beck. And it was even further. It's just so funny when you think about Georgia was essentially emptying the bench on Saturday to the point that Stetson Bennett's brother was in the game. Mike Bobo's son was in the game. Will Muschamp's son's at quarterback. And with all of that said, still among the very last players to play for Georgia was Brett Thorson, which is really very funny because Georgia just wasn't punting, which kind of furthers all of that. So I do enjoy Thorson on social media. It's very good stuff. FSU's 3 points here. Very funny username at DawgNation.com discussing the Dogs win by 60. It's amazing. It's amazing. Joe Gagliardi says, my wife and I had a baby girl on Christmas Eve. So I haven't been here all week. Go Dogs. Joe, congratulations. That is thrilling news. Great to hear that. Boy, you love that. That's congratulations. Congratulations. John Chappell having some fun at Jim Harbaugh's expense. John, I love that. Very good stuff. DT says the people who mess with the college athletic system intended to blow it up. So here's the thing, DT, and I'm going to be very candid here for a moment. This is the thing that I think some of us have to figure out. And y'all, I'm about to be more honest with you for a moment than I perhaps typically am. One of the things that has allowed us to be successful on this show, to the extent that we've had success, one of the things that's allowed us to be successful is I'm pretty disciplined. Show up every day. We don't miss shows. Who knows what, the world throws at us from a technological standpoint, whatever else. We still just don't miss shows. I'm disciplined in that regard. That it's New Year's Day. I'm sitting here. I'm doing the show. That's one of the things that's allowed us to have the success we've had. The other way that discipline shows up for me, and this is the point I'm getting to, is I'm very careful about what I talk about. I stay in my lane. I don't come in here and try to be something that I'm not. I don't try to come in here and, kind of veer into topics that you're not interested in. I really, really work very hard to stay in my lane and make this be a show about Georgia football and about college football more broadly. But we're not kind of getting into the weeds in the wrong direction too much. Hopefully we're not anyway. Now, during the cool down, sometimes if somebody brings up pro wrestling, then I may spend, 20 or 30 seconds on that, much to the chagrin of some. But broadly speaking, part of the reason for our success is that we stay very disciplined and very much on topic. Here is the challenge that awaits people like me who are very careful about what we do and do not talk about. I think the proper defense of college athletics is going to require people being willing to talk about issues that are a little more divisive. And as you move into, why is it that people want to tear down college athletics? And as you move into what can be done from preventing that to happen, from happening, and should it be prevented? When you move into those topics, you are naturally moving into areas that are just a little bit more divisive, because even on a show like this, where so many of us, because we're all Georgia fans, we see the world in much the same way, at least large portions of the world much the same way. Even us, kind of people from sort of the same walk of life, even we would get divided pretty quickly if we started talking enough about this. And, frankly, topics that can divide is something that I have been disciplined enough to avoid. But if we're going to talk about how to save this sport from those who might try to ruin it, we got to be willing to move into an area that can be a little bit divisive. And that's tricky. It is. And I don't have an easy answer for you on that right now, but it is a real thing that there are plenty of things that I would like to say about this particular issue, or the fact that it seems like the college sports model is in danger of disappearing. There are plenty of things I would like to say about this, and I'm just not saying it. I'm just not. I don't think it's good for business. And so therefore, I'm just not saying it. And it's sort of fine for me to be that way. It's sort of fine for me to choose not to lead on this. And perhaps one of these days I'll change my mind, and one of these days I'll pay my mortgage off and I'll throw caution to the wind. I'll just start saying everything that's on my mind. One of these days, maybe I'll just let it rip. But that day is not today. And so it's sort of fine for me to say I'm going to play it somewhat safe, and I'm not going to veer into controversial topics. That's fine. But if we all choose not to veer into the controversy that comes from arguing on behalf of college athletics' right to exist, if we all choose not to engage in controversy as a way of, sort of staying out of the sort of less appealing areas of what we could be discussing, then we obviously know where college athletics is going, and it's going to nowhere good. And so I don't know what we do with that in the upcoming year, but I do believe that the forceful argument needed on behalf of college athletics and its right to exist is going to require having some conversations that are going to create some divisions among fans that people who do what I do for a living typically try to avoid. And I don't know what you do about that. Let me go to Facebook here for a moment. Steve Shafini says, look, anyway, the Pop-Tart mascot wants to live his life is okay with me. So I'm sort of weirdly okay with the kind of like crazy stuff we've seen from mascots and things like that in these bowl games. I mean, I do think there's an element of, if we all agree the bowl games are pretty ridiculous, and when Georgia's winning a bowl game by 60 points, then we've kind of gotten into ridiculous territory, then why not embrace it, and why not make it even more ridiculous, especially if that brings in more money to the bowl games? Because honestly, like, I like having bowls. And if it's one of those things where, like, you kind of during the holiday season, if you sit down in front of the couch, you start flipping channels, you realize there isn't a bowl game on, I'm pretty sad. I've never seen a bowl game that I didn't think had a right to exist. And so if Pop-Tarts and Cheez-Its and mayonnaise and stuff like that, now listen, if my life depended on it, if my children's health depended on it, I'm not quite so sure I'd let somebody pour mayonnaise all over me. But if that's what keeps the bowl system up and running, I'm kind of okay with that. Marshall Fleming says, this is where some of y'all get me in trouble, but y'all be mad at Marshall Fleming. Don't be mad at me. He says, and I'm kidding, Marshall. He says, speaking of wrestling, have you seen Iron Claw? Zac Efron is huge. Could not believe he got that huge. Yeah. as far as like what Zac Efron did to get as ripped as he is for Iron Claw, I'll let other people other than me sort of figure what that's all about. But as far as the movie goes, I have not seen it yet, but I am dying to see it. We were talking about this a little bit the other day with some of the folks off the air, that the fact that the Von Erich story, one of the most compelling and honestly tragic and sad stories in professional wrestling history, is getting this level of treatment, a major Hollywood movie like this. I am so fascinated by it. I want to see it so badly. I'm really, really excited about that. So I have not seen it yet. I've heard good things about it. And obviously, if you grew up like me in kind of the 80s, like the Von Erichs, yeah, at a time in which the wrestling landscape's a lot different than it is now. Now we have like two major organizations, but there was a lot more fragmentation of the wrestling landscape back in the 80s. You had the true territories and the Texas territory, the world-class territory that the Von Erichs kind of ran. Man, big deal, big stuff, and I can't wait to see the movie. Lucy Bowers-Boykin says, I don't even know Zac Efron. Well, Lucy, if you're like most ladies, you may be happy to be introduced to him if you get a chance. Let's see what else. Jalen Jackson says, and what Jalen's doing right here is what we're all about to start doing. So let me read this from Jalen, who says, so let me get this straight. Next year, the top four teams get buys, but they don't get to play a playoff game at home. Seems kind of backwards. I would prefer UGA to be a 5 or 6 seed and not to win the SEC so we can play a playoff game in Athens. So what Jalen is doing, this is what the new year is going to be. It's going to be a lot of, all right, so what are we doing now? What are the new rules? What's the new system? And Jalen's exactly right, that in a roundabout way, being one of the top 4 seeds is seemingly better because you avoid an additional round of playoffs. That seems like it'd be to your advantage, right? The same way that it used to be the top 2 seeds. Now it's just the top seed. And the NFL playoffs gets the bye out of the wild card round into the divisional round. That used to be kind of the way that things were. Well, now college football has a version of that too. But Jalen's right. Even though it seems like 1, 2, 3, and 4 seeds have the advantage, I believe most teams are actually going to view this the way that Jalen did. I want to be 5, 6, 7, 8 because I want a playoff game at home. In fact, to further this point even more, Jalen, one of the guys that was on the committee that came up with this system, he's not Notre Dame athletic director anymore, but he was Notre Dame athletic director at the time. His name's Jack Swarbrick. He was on the committee that established this system. Do you know that one of the guys on the committee who had every, I guess, incentive to want to argue on behalf of what benefited Notre Dame the most, do you know that Notre Dame, because it's not in a conference, is not eligible to be one of the top 4 seeds? The top 4 seeds are exclusively reserved for the highest rated conference champions, the 4 highest rated conference champions, which Notre Dame cannot be because Notre Dame is not in a league. So that gives you an idea how valuable being especially like a 5 or a 6 seed, one of those, teams that playing an easy game theoretically before moving on. Being a 5, 6, 7, 8 seed next year is going to be so valuable that the Notre Dame athletic director basically saw his team get penalized for not being at a conference and on a committee that he was on didn't do anything to stop it, because I think everybody likes the idea of this, which would lead you, Jalen, then to say this. Well, how long is this system going to last? If being one of the top 4 seeds is not going to be as attractive as being like 5, 6, 7, 8, that doesn't feel like the kind of system that can last very long. So it sort of seems like all of this may just be a precursor to eventually another round of home playoff games in the future. Bottom line is, I enjoy the bowl games. People still enjoy the bowl games. I'll give you another piece of insight here. You don't care about any of this. I totally understand. But not only did like 10 million people watch the bowl game on TV on Saturday, like I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about numbers, things like that. Thankfully, our numbers, just broadly speaking, are high enough. That's all I really care about. But I mean, when it's all said and done, our highest sort of viewed post-game show of the year is going to probably end up being this so-called meaningless game against Florida State. Fans like bowl games. Because for the average fan, bowl game means holiday time at home, kicking back, relaxing, no work the next day. For many people in this situation, bowl games are still pretty popular, broadly speaking, with the average college football fan. But the idea of traveling to the neutral site for the games, I don't know how much more of that there's going to be. I'm talking about long-term future. Obviously, next year there's going to be more of that than ever. But long-term future, I don't quite know how much of that there's going to be, because I do believe that once people get a taste of hosting a home playoff game, especially for these Big Ten teams, it's a big deal for us because we've never seen it before. It's a huge deal for teams up north because we've never had a true, right? I mean, like, we've never had a real true cold weather, game of huge importance in college football. But much the same way, weather is a massive factor for the NFL playoffs. Weather is a massive factor in the NFL playoffs. Y'all, next year, weather is going to be a huge factor, for the college football playoff. Because think about this. So 5 plays 12, 6 plays 11, and then like 7, I guess, plays 10, and then 8 plays 9, right? Did I do that right? So think about like the 8th seed, the 9th seed. The 8th seed and the 9th seed is the difference between being at home and being on the road. That's 1 degree of difference. Who's ranked 8th? Who's ranked 9th? I mean, as it stands right now, we don't spend 5 seconds thinking about that. Just put one of them at 8, put one of them at 9, just sort of slot them in there. But next year, you're gifting at least 3 points to one of those 2 teams. So when I say, and I've said this now a million times, that there's going to be way more arguing in the future, this is a perfect example of this. The difference next year between the 8 seed and the 9 seed is massive, especially if it's an SEC team and a Big Ten team, because it could be the difference between playing in Athens, 58 degrees, slight breeze, sunny skies, or playing in State College, Pennsylvania. I don't expect Georgia or Penn State to be 8, 9 seed. I'm just giving you an example. State College, PA, where it might be 10 degrees. I mean, it was. Think about it. Did you watch the Falcons Bears yesterday? It was snowing all day in Chicago. Y'all, it's winter up north. It's winter up there. And next year, that's where the playoffs are going to be played. Let's see what else. Steve Shavini says it's going to be like he says 12 is better than 4, which I totally agree. He says it's going to be like the on the bubble discussion with the NCAA tournament. So my number one argument, Steve, in favor of the expanded playoff is I'm in favor of anything that takes power away from the committee. I don't trust them. I don't trust their competence. I'm not sure I trust their judgment. I just don't trust the committee. There's the old line. I would rather the college football playoff be selected by the first 25 names in the phone book than the people who are currently on the college football playoff selection committee. I just would. Go to any message board anywhere in the country, select 25 message board posters at random. I would rather them choose the playoff teams than the people on the committee. I just don't trust them. And so whatever can happen to take power away from this body, I'm in favor of. And expanded playoffs, I believe, do that. Let's see what else. Jay Shipes. See, I was about to read one of Jay's comments, interact with Jay. It's a new year. And it's like, and so what y'all don't realize is like, as I'm reading, I'm also, see, I've learned to do a couple things here. I've learned to read and sort of scan ahead at the same time. I mean, Jay, for one day, can you be more appropriate? Good gracious. Randy Payne says, thanks for giving my daughter a shot. See, this is how you comment, right? This is nice, wholesome, family-friendly comment. Randy's family's growing. He's got big things happening in 2024. That's what our comments should be. Andrew Hughes says, how about Kirby Smart allowing players to celebrate in the end zone? I loved it. I did too. I thought it was great. I really did. And they were having a good time. Yo, Georgia football is a grind. It is so hard. It is so hard. It was kind of funny. I was out there, the last practice of the year took place on Friday, and they invited us out there for a few minutes of that. So I was watching. They weren't doing anything. But it's still one of those things where you just get the vibe on the practice field of it's obvious those players had been through a lot. And it was that feeling of now it's over and we're just doing our final stretches here. We're kind of going through the motions for what's going to be the final. It's always, to me, interesting that when a football season comes to an end, because it just sort of feels like there's always a next day and a next thing. And when it comes to an end, it's just the end. And there was a degree to which this game on Saturday reminded me of the TCU game a year ago, where like all of a sudden you can just sort of let your hair down. And Georgia wasn't saving anything for a future game, and so it just sort of turned it loose and just sort of beat TCU unmercifully. Just merciless beatdown of TCU, because at that point in time there was no reason not to. And Florida State, or some reasonable facsimile thereof, was on the receiving end of that for this particular game. And Georgia was sort of cutting up and cutting loose. And they were dancing in the end zone and getting 15-yard penalties and stuff like that. And I'm glad they did, because if you can endure a Georgia football season as a player, then you deserve to celebrate. You deserve to enjoy yourself. You deserve to cut up a little bit. And so I was glad they did. Jay Scheib says, I like when BA gives him compliments. See, that's the problem with Jay. He takes that as a compliment. Jay, you're a funny guy. You are a funny guy. Let's see what else. Jalen Jackson says, so how will the New Year's Six be decided? How will they choose what 4 will be round 2 and the remaining 2 games will be round 3? Do the top 4 get to pick? Okay, so what you're asking is a good question. By the way, this is, I think, Jalen now moving to a new platform, which is always a very smooth move. We have the sites selected for next year, and I guess that means that those are the New Year's Six games. So, for instance, Atlanta next year is a quarterfinal game, and it's hosting the championship game. So if Georgia handles its business the right way, it may play 4 games in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Clemson, SEC championship, possible quarterfinal game, possible national championship game. And once again, to go back to the idea of, you got to be ready to argue next year. You got to be ready for arguing. Georgia playing a quarterfinal game in Atlanta would be a very big deal. So arguing, everybody's got to be arguing. Everybody's going to be arguing. Georgia's got to be ready to do some arguing too. This is just what the sport is. It's about to be a lot of arguing. Brain Dead Gum says, I cannot agree more about the committee, BA. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Brain Dead. Thank you for joining me there in that belief that we got to take power away from this group. I appreciate that. But to go back to Jalen's original question of, so I guess the New Year's Six games are all just playoff games next year. And it's a little bit like, for those of you who like college basketball, now they have the pod thing for the first 2 rounds, but it used to be you had like your sort of sub-regional spot, and you had your regional spot, and you had your Final Four spot. So it's like, if you're a Kentucky basketball fan, a lot of those fans would, they would sort of choose, okay, do we want to go to the regional location, which might be like St. Louis, or it might be East Rutherford, New Jersey, or it might be somewhere like that, Philadelphia, or do we want to save our money and go to the Final Four, or are we like just blue blood rich folks, and we're going to go to both spots or all 3 spots, or go to the SEC? See, like, once again, like, to use Kentucky basketball as an example, they call it Catlanta, right? Kentucky fans take over Atlanta for the SEC tournament. They legitimately do. They take it over for the SEC tournament. And then some of those fans will then travel to see their team in the like first 2 rounds of the NCAA tournament, wherever they're playing. And then there's a much larger, contingent that goes to like the regional spot. That's where you earn your way into the Final Four. And then there's a Final Four location there as well. And you stay there for like 4 days because the semifinals are on Saturday. The championship game is not till Monday. That's what college football is about to be. So I hope y'all are rich. Hope y'all are just made of money, because if you like traveling to Georgia games, it's about to get pricey moving forward. Sling Blade Napier says, I will argue while the rest of our fans cry about Bama. I'd argue if we lost every game. Yeah, so Sling Blade, I think, is bringing up a really good point. And I realize that not all of you agree with me on this. But let me see if I can find it. I got a tweet about this. Let me see if I can find this tweet. Let me see if I can talk and write at the same time. And we're going to wrap this up here in a minute. I'm not going to be able to find it. But basically, what somebody said to me on Twitter, and I get the perspective on this from a Georgia fan, because I made the case yesterday that what Georgia did against Florida State is actually not all that different from what Georgia does against anybody. They just beat teams up. And what a Georgia fan said back to me is, well, I get that, but until we do the same thing to Alabama, it's all a moot point. And I want to deal with this just for a second. I know it seems that way, and this is what the rest of college football wants you to think. that as long as you're 3 points worse than Alabama, you don't deserve a spot in the conversation. But y'all, that's choosing to argue based on someone else's rules. That's choosing to argue based on someone else's terms for the discussion. It does stink that Georgia lost to Alabama. And Alabama's a tough team to beat. That's just a fact. Alabama's a grizzly bear, right? They're a very, very difficult dynasty to topple. It's just true. We all understand that. We know how real that is. But the idea that Georgia being miles better than every other team in America, the idea that's not even the fact that that's not even worth considering, that's what they want you to think. They want you to think that. And, this notion of we already lost Alabama, so therefore we don't deserve a rematch. No one who's an Alabama fan is going to be saying that on Monday or next Monday if they're playing Texas. No one's going to be saying that. Whatever is in your own best argument, that is the argument you ought to be making. And, this idea of we lost Alabama, therefore we don't deserve it. If you concede that point, then you're doing exactly what Michigan and all these other teams want you to do. And you just simply shouldn't do that. Christopher W. says BA is right. We have to fight for our own narrative. You do. And I know it's somewhat distasteful. Remember, in American history, for a long time, like I'm talking about well into the 1800s, right? It was seen as tacky to campaign on behalf of yourself for president. Well, now that's obviously not the case anymore. So I realize, there's a certain tackiness about arguing too forcefully for your own best interest. But as tacky as it might seem, no one else that Georgia competes with has that problem, including the team that Georgia competes with the most, Alabama. They are more than happy of making whatever case needs to be made at any given time. Alabama lost twice last year, and Nick Saban was still, up until the very last second, pounding his fist on the table, but the fact that Alabama should be in the playoff because they'd be a point spread favorite against almost every other team. They lost twice, and he was still making that argument. Y'all, if you want to be like Bama, you got to argue like Bama, and that's just a fact. Jay Shipe says that Bama getting help to win a national title is a great trade-off for Saban retiring. I get what you're saying, Jay, but the truth is I don't want Saban to retire. Saban owes it to Georgia to be on that sideline in September of next year. He can't tuck tail and run right now. He just can't. He owes it to Georgia to be on that sideline next year. We have not had, and keep this in mind, in the entirety of the Kirby Smart era at Georgia, there hasn't been a single instance of Georgia versus Alabama in a full stadium under normal conditions. There hasn't been a Georgia-Alabama matchup in the entire Kirby Smart era under normal circumstances. They've met in the regular season just one time. It was pandemic year of 2020. We all know that doesn't count. We haven't seen a normal matchup in the regular season between Georgia and Alabama the entire time. Alabama has successfully ducked Georgia in the regular season for the entirety of the Kirby Smart era. That changes next season, and Alabama has the benefit of having that game in Tuscaloosa. But nonetheless, Georgia finally gets the regular season opportunity that it's been hoping for against Alabama. Nick Saban owes it to Georgia to be on the sideline for that game. He can't tuck tail and run right now. He just simply can't. Let's see what else. All right, it is late. We got to go. I said we're going to get out here early. So Worried About America says, before you get into a fight, you got to look over the landscape and decide if your best case holds water. And to let Georgia in, you have to say what Texas and Washington did deserve reward. So I got no problem with that. And I've got no problem looking at anyone from Seattle and saying, why would I respect your conference championship in a league that doesn't exist anymore? And I mean that as much as I mean anything. I would have had no problem looking at undefeated Washington and saying, enjoy the Holiday Bowl. Because that's a league that no longer exists. Washington was more than happy to run to the Big Ten because the Pac-12 is dissolving. So the idea of their conference championship gives them cachet over Georgia. We all know that the Pac-12 does not stand on equal footing with the SEC. In fact, the Pac-12 doesn't stand at all anymore. So if all I need to do to get Georgia in the playoff is exclude Washington, I would do that without losing a minute's worth of sleep. In the case of Texas, I realize that Texas has the best win in America this year. They won at Alabama. But guess what? Texas beating Alabama is a reason for keeping Alabama out of the playoff. It's not a reason for keeping Georgia out of the playoff. Texas's head-to-head win against Alabama is just not that relevant in a comparison between Texas and Georgia. It's just not. Now, if you wanted to exclude Alabama because Texas already beat them, that's fine. But excluding Georgia because Texas beat Alabama doesn't make any logical sense. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. Let's see what else. Johnny Surf Dog says Happy New Year's. All right, we're going to go, y'all. One trip around the comment section, then we're going to go. DT says, when Saban argued for Bama last year, you said it made him look small. Well, it did make him look small because they lost twice. Y'all, Georgia's lost once by 3 points. And this is just the way it's going to go. Saban begging when they lost twice is a far together different thing than Georgia saying, you know what? After winning 29 straight games, losing one game by 3 points probably doesn't knock us down from number 1 and number 6. Those arguments are completely different things. Completely different things. And DT says that he agreed with what I said then and still thinks that's true now. All I can tell you is that is what the rest of college football hopes that Georgia thinks. Because the rest of college football is going to do anything that it can to make the playing field seem level. That somehow Georgia losing one game by 3 points diminishes them in comparison to an ACC team or a Pac-12 team or something like that. We all know those other leagues don't have any relevance in comparison to the best of the SEC, the Georgias and the Alabamas and most years teams like that. So if as Georgia fans, we're willing to take a knee, if the program is willing to take a knee because of one loss, then the rest of the nation is going to be thrilled by that because that is what they've set the entire system to make us believe, that somehow the second best SEC team, which Georgia may be, obviously they lost to Alabama, that somehow the second best SEC team doesn't have a favorable argument in comparison to the best of the Pac-12, the best of the ACC, the best of the Big 12. They would be thrilled. By they, I mean the rest of the country. They would be thrilled if we would concede that argument. And shame on Georgia if it does. All right, on Facebook one final time. Steve Schaffini also pointing out that Florida State was ranked ahead of Georgia, which is obviously pretty ridiculous. Roy Roper says, why are we playing at Bama again? I thought it was a home and home. Well, the issue is that technically both of these years, I know this is like really complicated. Technically 2020 and 2024 are not regular schedule rotation years. 2020 was a one-off year because of the pandemic. They tore up the normal schedule and they put a one-year schedule in place. So therefore, Georgia went to Alabama. And technically speaking, the 2024 schedule is also a one-off because the league has not been able to come to agreement on a long-term scheduling option. So they're doing a one-time schedule, 8-game conference slate for the upcoming year as a way of buying themselves one more year to figure out what they're doing long-term. So it just so happens that in both the years in which the SEC is doing a one-off schedule, Georgia gets the privilege of playing in Tuscaloosa. So I guess do with that what you will. Barry Watkins says, are you pulling for Bama today? I really don't know, Barry. I'm not pulling for anybody. You know, at one point in time, I wasn't even sure I was going to watch the game. Like now I do want to watch the game, but I'm not excited about it. Y'all, if Alabama just runs roughshod through these ham and egg tin cans from these other leagues, I'm going to be so frustrated. I just am. I'm going to be so frustrated. And Bama, listen, good team that, you know, they deserve it. Whatever. But I have a sneaking suspicion that Bama is going to win by 3 touchdowns today. And that is going to aggravate me to no end when it happens. It's going to be like 2012 all over again, or, you know, certainly, I don't know. So I'm going to be watching, but I don't know that I'm rooting for the sunset. I'll be rooting for the sunset over the San Gabriel Mountains because that's the only thing that's going to happen today on that TV screen that I'm going to like. All right, we're going to go for now. R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Y'all, thanks for being here. New Year's Day, you got a lot of things you could do. I appreciate that. Find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. including heating systems, getting them tuned back up to factory fresh specs, or water heaters, getting them replaced if you need to the same day. Whatever your issues are, don't procrastinate on that in the new year. Let RS Industries take good care of you. We may even have Dari from the show on at some point in time this week to kind of recap the season that was on Go With the Flow there as well. So Happy New Year. Y'all have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow in some form or fashion on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.